Still nothing?
Still nothing?
Relying on you, Andy, to let me know. Okay, let me just try this a different way. Screen, desktop, share.
There we go. Something's coming up.
Okay.
Don't share your deepest, darkest secrets. That's your web link to the Zoom. So you just need to find your. There we go. There we go.
Can you see my speaker notes, or can you just see Marcus Joster's beautiful face?
I can see his pretty face. What a darling.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you, Brindell, and maybe we can even get you back if your sound quality improves.
Yeah.
Good evening to all of you who are in the same time zone as me, and hello to everyone else wherever you are. I'm grateful that you signed in. Late in 2018, Warren Thompson, a journalist at the Financial Mail, and I published this article. It was a story about the multinational corporation Steinhoff, its former CEO Marcus Joester, and allegations of corporate fraud over nearly 2 decades. Steinhoff is a furniture company listed in South Africa and Germany. It's one of the giants on the South African Stock Exchange. Most South Africans with a pension owned a portion of it. But in December 2017, its CEO, Marcus Joester, resigned amidst allegations of overstated profits and assets and fraud. The stock crashed and many people lost a lot of wealth. And there were a number of regulatory and internal investigations underway in Germany and here in South Africa. There was also excellent financial analysis and investigative journalism, which outlined publicly an alleged pattern of self-dealing across many aspects of the business. This had painted a picture of a modus operandi with Steinhoff's balance sheet on one side and people associated with the company, insiders, on the other side. What was missing from much of that reporting, all of that reporting, was proof of Marcus Joester's double dealing. Our story, which you can see on the slide, provided that proof. We showed that Marcus Joester held secret stakes in offshore companies that traded with Steinhoff from more or less the day that it listed for Marcus Joester's covert benefit. On the slide are 2 linchpins for Marcus Joester's activities. On the left is British property developer M King, and on the right is George Allen Evans, a Jersey-based former banker. They helped to set up the deals that we wrote about. And King now owns a very impressive British real estate portfolio that we suggest was built. Sorry, Siri was just hijacking my computer. That we suggest was built with the secret help of Marcus Joester and Steinhoff's balance sheet. But let's step back. Today we're here to talk about how to investigate using openly sourced, publicly and freely available information. That's the stuff in my first column on the left. I'd like to walk you through some parts of our investigation in a quite ad hoc fashion to make the very simple points that most of the information I've ever needed for any of my investigations was freely available. This open source information provided essential material for hypotheses, leads, and context, and that it worked best when we overlaid it with other sources of information, such as human intelligence. Our story started with a hypothesis based on a body of publicly available information. For example, at about the time Marcus Joester resigned and the Steinhoff stock crashed, the short seller Viceroy Research published a substantial report forensically analyzing deals and raising questions and outlining their thesis that Steinhoff management was using off-balance sheet entities to obscure losses and enrich themselves. Among the red flags, Viceroy pointed to the role of a mysterious man named George Allen Evans. He was involved in many of the suspicious transactions. Evans is one of the offshore linchpins I mentioned earlier. I showed you a copy of his passport. Very helpfully, a smart young financial analyst with the anonymous Twitter profile JSE Dog traversed the public records and presented a neat hypothesis, which I'll explain. His hypothesis formed the core of our investigation. His first port of call was the Panama Papers. For those who don't know, the Panama Papers was a leak of millions of offshore records to journalists at the German outlet Süddeutsche Zeitung, The German journalists in turn brought in the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and the team shared the leak with selected investigative journalists all around the world, including ourselves at Amopungani. Although the full leak was not made public, the ICIJ did publish limited structured data on a website called Offshore Leaks. There, JSE Dog typed in the word Steinhoff, and he found his way to Steinhoff's Bahamas registered property company called Alveglen Estates. You can see it lying at the center of the spidergram. The Panama Papers showed that Alveglen Estates had had multiple owners over the years, including Steinhoff, and the publicly available part of the database provided a timeline of ownership, which showed that for about 15 years, this property company was bounced between multiple shareholders, Steinhoff on one side and anonymous offshore shell companies on the other. Some of these shareholders only owned Alveglen Estates and its property portfolio for a few days before flipping it on to the next owner and back to Steinhoff. JSE Dog tweeted, "These are major red flags that unknown shells become shareholders in Alveglen for just a couple of days. But it gets better. Some of these shell companies can be traced back to close associates of Steinhoff." He went on to suggest that all of the offshore companies linked to George Allen Evans, some of them linked to George Allen Evans, still a mystery man at this point, and Malcolm King, whose mystery was unraveling on the pages of South African newspapers. He is the other man with a passport that I showed you earlier. JSE Dog noted that Malcolm King had a British property company called Formal Investments. It managed the properties in Alveglen's portfolio. And other journalists discovered and publicly reported that Malcolm King at least nominally owned an upmarket Cape Town apartment, which was occupied by Marcus Jooster's romantic partner. Meanwhile, Marcus Jooster's personal assets were being liquidated, and the publicly available court papers provided vital clues. Among them was the fact that two companies linked to Malcolm King had passed large amounts of money to Marcus Jooster. These were purported to be loans, but numerous corruption scandals had taught South Africans that fictitious loans are often used to launder money. So JSE Dog set out his hypotheses. Alveglen was flipped between Steinhoff and Malcolm King and George Allen Evans, at each step siphoning capital from Steinhoff's balance sheet. And, he hypothesized, Malcolm King returned the favor to Jooster with so-called loans and high-end properties. Over at the Financial Mail, journalist Warren Thompson was asking similar questions. Was Malcolm King in fact Marcus Jooster's bagman, collecting and laundering illicit wealth? I thought that these were very strong hypotheses on the publicly available evidence. For the purpose of what we're discussing today, I emphasize that the hypotheses were based 100% on publicly available information. The most important and difficult part of the investigation was done using information that anyone could access. More, the well-developed hypothesis was itself laid out on Twitter for all to see. It formed the body of open source intelligence, saving me a lot of trouble. At Amabungani, where I worked, we were partnered to the ICIJ, so we had full access to the Panama Papers. And the data held many, many emails between offshore lawyers and people associated with Malcolm King and Allen Evans. The data revealed vital details of shareholders and provided many more clues. So I called up Warren Thompson at Financial Mail and we teamed up. He knew the open source material well and had more leaked documents, and I had the key to the Panama Papers. In my next few slides, I want to make the point that we found it to be essential to overlay our non-public information with open source information. We used that analysis to identify potential eyewitnesses and other potential sources. Once we had spoken to some of them and learned a little more, we overlaid that knowledge onto our existing analysis and so on. This is from the Panama Papers. It's an Alveglen Estates document discussing the property company that was later flipped between Steinhoff and Evans and King. This, read with other documents, showed that King was able to get a bank loan and buy a factory based on Steinhoff's promise that it would then let the property. Many British property records are available on the internet. This is the Alveglen Estates property leased by and later bought by Steinhoff. Here, we use Google Street View to stake out the property without flying to England. And we can see in the little square in the distance that Steinhoff occupied it at the time that Google's car drove past and took this photograph. And here we can see that at that same time, Malcolm King's company was managing the property. We used targeted searching to get behind the face of Malcolm King's property website, and we were able to catalog all the properties that they had marketed on there. We then rummaged around the internet and Steinhoff's public paperwork and cataloged all of the properties that it had occupied across the UK. Using Street View, Google searches, Panama Papers, public property records, and human intelligence, we were able to identify that Steinhoff had actually leased numerous properties from companies linked to Malcolm King and George Allen Evans. Almost all of these were held via offshore companies. We went back to the UK property records and pulled all of the documents for all of these properties. Other UK government websites had published planning permissions for building work for most of these properties. Stacks of documents with names, signatures, phone numbers, details of the relations with Steinhoff, and more. We pulled those too. Here on the slide, we identified George Allen Evans's link to a Steinhoff-occupied property by comparing the signature on publicly available documents with specimens held in the Panama Papers. This offshore web had representatives based in South Africa too, and we were particularly interested in them. Here is an international man of mystery with a local profile that we think jarred with his picture of immense offshore property wealth. We researched him and others like him via LinkedIn, the South African Companies Registry and Deeds Offices, Facebook, Street View, and much more. Here we used Jersey and British corporate registries, again publicly available, to find numerous clues, including updated Evans and King addresses. And it turned out they were neighbors in Jersey. We could find out on Google Street View, and we could corroborate that by convincing Jersey residents to take a walk up there and stake out the properties for us. More importantly, and not shown here, we used the publicly available British Companies Registry to analyze ownership chronologies of various companies in the King and Evans web. And this provided vital clues to later prove some of Marcus Jooster's secret stakes. With ever so slightly deeper internet searching, we found leads that others had missed. Here we see Evans had run-ins with the law. And here we see that long ago, a Polish journalist alleged that Evans had helped to launder the illicit wealth of Polish and Russian state officials, and that Evans was involved in insider trading on a stock market. Here's an internal memo of ours, setting out publicly available sources in red that we used, and potential eyewitnesses in green that we wanted to approach. Policemen, auditors, lawyers, journalists, a group of reportedly assaulted women, former colleagues of Evans, Joost and King, spouses of implicated officials, and so on. Once we had run down all of our leads, we took to Twitter with tidbits of information to try to entice potential sources to come forward. All of that information in those tweets is publicly available. Again, LinkedIn, Street View, British corporate records. All of this effort, built initially and later corroborated with openly sourced information, led to a stunning break for us. I must be vague here to protect our various sources, but this document is one of many sources, public and non-public, that eventually allowed us to prove that Marcus Jooster and others at Steinhoff had held stakes in this offshore web that had been spun by Malcolm King and George Allen Evans. Here is another internal sketch of ours. It unpacks most of our eventual forensic findings. The ultimate owners of the offshore companies are at the top, including Steinhoff insiders, Marcus Jooster, Evans, and King. The web of offshore companies in which they held their secret stakes is in the middle. And at the bottom are assets of various kinds that they had traded with Steinhoff, mainly properties, but also listed stocks and unlisted shares. To review, I just want to emphasize again, openly sourced information was essential for our hypothesis development. It enriched our questions and storytelling ability, and it helped us to identify critical leads. Overlaying that open source information with non-public documentation and human intelligence proved to be essential. And while I was putting this together, three anecdotes came to mind that I thought would be interesting for you. Before we did this report, an excellent European journalist followed exactly the same Alberglen trail. They relied almost entirely on the Panama Papers, and the result was a quite vague report without a clear finding. Deep access to a stash of records was not enough. At the same time that we were investigating this, another brilliant investigator, this one private, was also following the same trail as us, but relying exclusively on open sourced intelligence. They could not reveal themselves or their client by openly asking questions. They didn't crack it in the end, and their client was a little irritated to have spent so much money on an investigation only to then read our story in the press. It's not a fair comparison, I think, but my point is that open source information on its own can be limited. And unrelated to Steinhoff, I once pulled together an article analyzing aspects of a multinational company's transfer pricing on the basis of public records. Months later, I ran into a top transfer pricing investigator at a revenue collector who had looked into this company. They were astonished that a journalist was able to find compelling information and make a coherent analysis that they had not been able to. And they were more astonished that the research was entirely open sourced. My impression was that that team of revenue collectors relied very heavily on their mandated access to information and missed important clues that were lying in plain sight. Journalists are forced to use a very wide base of sources, relying specifically and heavily on open source information. And that can yield very fantastic results. And that's me. Thank you all very much. Oh, before I end, here are my unique identifiers if you want to use Multigo to investigate me. And below them are the URL and emails for Amabungani.
Well done, Craig. I like that. Well done, man. Well done. Right. Any questions? But I've got one for you, Craig.
Go for it.
Yeah. Is Steinhoff finished? Is this investigation done? I know it's a little bit off topic, but is it done? Is there still a lot more to come?
I'm just trying to find a screenshot that somebody sent me today on WhatsApp. It's a Cape Talk article that has a picture of Marcus Jooste sitting in the dock saying Steinhoff wants to pay 17 billion rand to end its 135 billion rand lawsuit nightmare, with a caption, "Meanwhile, the Hawks," that's South Africa's special corruption investigators, "have not so much as knocked on Marcus Jooste's door," says Financial Mail editor Rob Rose. There is very little sign of there being any accountability. I have not been following Steinhoff very closely since then, but yeah, there's not much sign of accountability. They are fighting transparency. Amabungani and the Financial Mail are going or have gone to court to fight for their access to Steinhoff's internal forensic investigation report, which the directors have not made available. I didn't mention it, but our investigation here showed that those secret stakes held by Marcus Jooste were also held by the Steinhoff family in Germany. And at the time that we did this report, a member of that Steinhoff family was still on the board of Steinhoff, trying to rescue the corporation. Questions have since been asked of another key member of that board whose job was to sweep everything clean there. So my cynicism runs extremely deep.
Awesome. Okay, just one question I had from somebody that unfortunately had to leave, but they wanted me to just ask you, they haven't yet finished their journalism courses and they want a little bit of advice. What is the entry point, or is there any special techniques or personality they need to become an investigative journalist? It's a common question we also get in the investigative industry.
I don't have an easy answer for that. You have to be passionate about it because it's damn hard. It can get really boring at times. it can seem frustrating at times, and you go through a roller coaster of emotions and experience. You have to be inquisitive. I really believe that your motivation has to be to serve the public interest, and that's your guiding light every day, every decision you make, every fact that you include and exclude needs to be guided by that. You should need to be able to communicate your findings in a coherent way, whether in writing or verbally or graphically. You need to be able to hold complicated ideas in your mind at the same time. Not every investigation and every way of investigating has to be the way that the Steinhoff story was about. You know, there are other more human, less data-driven ways of approaching things, but you need to be able to see the complexities of the world and understand that sometimes we have to live with a degree of cognitive dissonance.
All right, Alex wants to know he wants to know, what tools did you use during your investigation? I know that can be quite broad, but what were your primary tools? Let's put it that way.
I would refer back to things that I referenced in my presentation. Twitter, Street View, company records in the UK and South Africa, and many other places where some company records are publicly available. Google Street View and Google Maps. I spent a lot of time driving the Google streetcar up and down the streets of Jersey and a derelict part of Western Britain. Not very fancy tools, actually. The Panama Papers was naturally a fancy tool, but in particular, whilst my access to the Panama Papers was useful, it was the structured, publicly available part of the Panama Papers that really provided the lead. And something I didn't say is that to be honest, the ultimate big break, or the lead, like the really good things that we eventually found, were lying there in broad daylight. And if one just had to ask the right questions and Google the right things, and they were there, then you had to pick up your phone and phone a few people. Really simple tools, not complicated data stuff here.
Okay, cool, man. Thanks again.
There's a question from Susan Comrie over there.
Yes.
She wants to know how to keep an investigation focused and on track when there are so many rabbit holes to go down. And a couple of things: good management and guidance from my bosses at Amobongani. Between us, a reasonably well developed nose on how to chase a story, but most importantly, a well developed hypothesis at the start of the investigation that is built up on a credible base of facts. And that's the main thing that guides you. You might refine it along the way. You might develop other hypotheses. And I did go down a lot of rabbit holes, a lot more than I presented here. But that hypothesis is critical.
Yeah.
So Andy, maybe this next question is for you. How can someone start a career in OSINT journalism or investigative journalism? Maybe that's something both Craig and you want to.
The journalism part I'll leave to Craig. On the OSINT side is, you know, you got to have, I suppose it's very similar in many ways. So I don't want to step out of my field. And I certainly wouldn't speak on behalf of journalists, but I do suspect that there are quite a few similarities. And I think the most important thing is that analytical mind, that inbuilt curiosity. I noticed there are a few of our students here on tonight, and welcome, guys. Nice to see you all. It's something that we try and teach them to develop. It's not always for everyone. We have to be fair about that. And, but within time, with practice and with experience, it comes to you. And you know when it comes to you. And that's what makes awesome investigators. And one thing I need to dovetail off from what Craig says is that hypothesis. We see too many investigators fail because of bad hypotheses and that sort of thing. And they don't develop the investigation plan around that. Craig, any more comments on that?
Yeah, I think that the best way to start a career in investigative journalism is to start a career in journalism driven by a desire to serve the public interest. And then every single article or report that you do, you take a critical, skeptical mind to it, and you ask questions and try to dig a little bit deeper. You build up your skills that way, and you are immediately doing investigative journalism. It just goes deeper and deeper. The other way to do it is just to simply do it. Develop a good hypothesis based on openly sourced information, put together a case that an editor cannot turn away, and take it to them. But I have to concede that the revenue model is a bit of a battle there.
Yeah. Okay, we won't go into that. Well, anybody's got any more? Yeah. Well, anybody's got any more questions? We've done some draws here, and the only prerequisite is that you've got to be in attendance. Our first one is
Andy. Do you maybe want to just quickly explain what the course is, what it's about?
I thought you were going to do that, Rigger. Okay, guys. Those of you that are not aware of the OSINT Basecamp course, it's your kickstart to OSINT investigations. I've had things thrown at me. Some people say it's very difficult. Other people say it's a walk in the park. I suppose it's personal perception in that sense. But if you are very keen on developing your OSINT career, your online research capabilities, online investigation capabilities, I believe this is a good starting point. We cover the main ingredients to be able to achieve that. And from there, you can develop up into a fairly professional investigator. And we're adding on a lot more modules. There's new modules that are coming out shortly. Does that do it, Rigo?
I think so.
And Rigo, guys, you must just understand, Rigo is one of my co-conspirators on this course, and he sets an awesome, what Craig talks about in terms of Google Maps and geolocation. Rigo set that assignment, so please don't get angry with me when you get stuck on it. You can disturb him at 12 o'clock at night and get mad with him. Well, if there are no more questions, Craig, anything else from your side?
Nothing from my side, no. Thank you.
It's a shame about Ronell, but thanks, Ronell, for sticking around. It's just one of those things. We will be doing this again. I think we're getting more and more inquiries for it, and we enjoy doing webinars, so we'll certainly do that. Any last minute questions there? Okay, thanks for that.
So,
okay, yeah, Rigo?
It's been great to have you all along for this. We're definitely going to be doing more of this in future, and stay tuned to our Twitter, Facebook, website, wherever you found this for more things that are coming up.
And you'll receive an email with all the links to Maltego, the trial sign up. You'll get a link to Hunchley as well. And by the way, Hunchley is included in that course. There's also a link for our training platform. We'd like to see you there. And once again, thank you very much for coming along.